Okay, on to Phoebe. And Phoebe, we're so happy to have you here today. And I just need to find your biography, which I very carefully put together here. I'm not, there we are. Okay. Um, Phoebe Wang is a first generation Chinese Canadian, and she lives and sails in Toronto, Canada. She's the author of poetry collections, Admission Requirements, shortlisted for the Gerald Lambert Memorial Award, the Pat Lowther Memorial Award, and nominated for the Trillium Book Award, and Waking Occupations, another book, and her nonfiction and fiction have appeared in the Globe and Mail, the New Quarterly, the Brick, and Unpublished City, shortlisted for a Toronto Book Award, and she edited the Unpublished City, Volume 2, The Living City. She has been a mentor with Diaspora Dialogues and is an adjunct professor and mentor at the University of Toronto in their Creative Writing Masters of Arts program, as well as a writing consultant with multilingual students at OCAD University. That is a huge bio there. What a wonderful life you've had and how much you've contributed to us with all of your writing. We'll just have to go out and buy some of your books, I think. And so Phoebe today is going to take us into the world of Dutch maritime art from the 17th century to the present day, with a bit of comparison to American maritime art. So Phoebe, welcome and thank you for doing this. You're on.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you all for having me. Okay, so I will start and share my screen. I made like a PowerPoint. Um, Presenter layout, entire screen.
We're all new to this game.
Okay, I think it just takes a moment for me to get my, yep, allow that. Okay, I think I might have to quit and reopen for
I
me
hope not.
to share the contents of my screen. Okay, let's try this in a minute. Might have to come back. Okay, the meeting.
Ron, can you help her in any way? Hi, Marlene.
You're muted.
Good. Yeah. She may have gone and is coming back. We'll see.
Okay, let's try this one more time. Been disabled person screen sharing. Share. Okay, it looks like it's working now. Okay, great. Can you all see my title slide, Dissolving Horizons? This is an engraving of New Amsterdam, which I found, one of the Dutch, Dutch colonies in the currently the state of New York. Okay, so let's see here.
That's really neat.
Yeah, I found some really great images. So I just wanted to precede this by saying that I am a writer and not a historian, not an art historian. I apologize in advance if I have some, factual information incorrect. What I wanted to share was really my appreciation for these amazing works of art and to look at them really with a bit of an art background. My parents are both painters. I grew up drawing and painting and going to a lot of galleries. So maybe if I did have any art knowledge, it would be mostly the Impressionists. So how I came across this subject was that I was writing an essay for my book, my essay collection on the concept of being becalmed. And I was really curious to see if there were any artists that had depicted the becalmed state. And I did find a couple of artists that did, paint these ships. And then that kind of opened up a whole, you know, period of art history, which I was not really familiar with. And I sort of didn't have time to really get into it in my book. My book is really not a book about art history. So I wanted to share some of the really interesting connections I found um, through the generations of the Dutch Golden Age artists and how they're still influencing contemporary art today. So I'll give you a bit of background context. Again, that period in the Dutch Republic and the Dutch history was very complex and a lot of geopolitical movement. So I'm sort of just capturing the main events which led to this rise of what we call the Dutch Golden Age. So I'm going to go through about 5 or 6 artists that were considered to be the most influential of their time, but there were so many working at the time, like I couldn't even go into it. And then I'll share a little bit of, especially if some of you are not familiar with looking at art, with talking about art, if you always feel really overwhelmed when you go to a gallery or in discussions about art, I want to show you something that we use here at OCAD University called Elements of Visual Analysis, which will really help you to appreciate and to view art and to see the different elements that kind of make up the composition. And then hopefully I will still have time to just share a couple of works that will really contrast well. My personal favorite being Turner, which I did spend some time writing about in my book. And 2 instances, Winslow Homer, possibly one of the greatest kind of American and maritime artists, and a contemporary artist, really interesting as well, Kehinde Wiley. And I wanted to show those as well because a lot of us struggle with contemporary art. But if we know what we're looking at and we see the allegory and symbolism that really tie back to earlier generations, it makes it easier to access and to understand the story behind some of these works. So you can see here, I was hard at work taking notes during my holiday a couple of years ago in Vancouver. I went to the Vancouver Public Library and took a whole bunch of books and notes. So if you would like access to some of my research materials, there's some really great books on the legacy of the Van der Veldes and the Dutch maritime arts as well. Too much information, yeah. So, in terms of this period, which we call the Dutch Golden Age, really got started with the formation of the Dutch Republic in 1588. And that formation happened through 7 Dutch provinces that were under the rule of Spain. And they had fought an 80 years war in order to break free of Spanish control. So it took them a really long time. And that was mainly due to the rise of Protestantism but also due to excess taxation. So they came out of this period of long, long struggle and war to assert their own national identity. It's the first independent Dutch republic, which is the kind of the predecessor of the current Dutch nation. Um, and because they had just come out of this long struggle, they were really having to kind of reestablish their art movement again. But these 7 provinces, which are, quite small in terms of geographic territory, and only had a population at the time of 1.5 million, they controlled the ports.
30.
So they also had control of global seafaring routes and became one of the wealthiest nations in Europe, which is quite impressive for such a small nation. And so they established the Dutch East India Trading Company, which is shown here in this engraving, as well as the Dutch East India Company, and that kind of gave rise to their colonial empire. And so arts, science like Anton van Leeuwenhoek's, microscope, trade, and military really flourished during this period. And so the shift was that under the predominant faith of Dutch Calvinism, which does not allow for depictions of God or religious paintings in church, what happened was that the people began wanting paintings in their homes. And so that those were the conditions in which the art trade really flourished. And another thing I came across, I was reading really late last night about the guild system. So, in order to be an artisan in the Dutch provinces, you needed to be a part of a guild. They had very strict rules about apprenticeships. If you want to sell art, you needed to be a member. So, I think also that guild system really helped promote the trade as well. So that's just something to keep in mind as well was that Dutch artists at this period did, I think they did make work that they considered to be, themselves beautiful and, works of art, but they were also creating work for a market, right? They were creating a product that were collected. So, and they needed to live, they needed to paint to survive. So we see for example, Vermeer painting still lives that were commissioned by his patrons, right? So, he had perhaps his own artistic creative goals and composition and color, but in the end, he also wanted to create something kind of marketable. So this was something very unique, these guilds. I believe they also had them in Italy. And what was also unique was that the provinces would each have their own guild. So if artists wanted to move, they actually needed to apply for citizenship in that city that were had their own separate governments and own separate guilds. So I think that also accounts for some of the movements of some of the artists as well. Um, and so there are five major genres of Dutch painting at this time, still lives and landscape. So I'm just going to be talking about the maritime genre. And so depicting Dutch shipping and also the Navy was a way for um, buyers, viewers, and audiences to display their nationalism, their pride in their own economic power at that time. So that's I think another reason why this type of work was so popular amongst the public. So I wanted to talk about these five or six main artists because of their special relationship to each other, and I'm going to show one or two works from each artist. First one would be Vroom. He was from Harlem, which maybe was what was like the name for the present day Harlem in New Jersey, United States. I wondered about that connection. He was born in 1566, so he would have kind of lived through the formation of the Dutch Republic. And he is considered to be the first maritime painter. Just about, fewer than 20 years later was born Jan Portelis, and he was Vroom's son-in-law and also possibly, quite possibly, I've seen different accounts, a pupil of Vroom. Next, I'll talk about Simon de Vigler, who was born in 1601. So again, the next generation, he's really seen as the bridge between the second and third generations. And he was Porcalis's pupil. And then Van der Velde, the young elder and younger, father and son, who who actually ended up moving to the UK, and that was a really interesting fact that I wanted to. I'll go into more. It's just such a fascinating story. But the Van der Velde, the elder Van der Velde, is the son of a Flemish barge and skipper. So he actually grew up on boats, and so he started sketching boats by being asked to being taken out. I'll go into that more later, but he didn't have any formal training. But he sent his son, Van der Velde, the younger, to train with de Vigler. And then a century later, you had Turner, who collected the works of Van der Velde and used them as references as well. So those are kind of the lineage that you see. And I think this is really a product of that guild system that really kind of nurtured the art and artisans in the Netherlands at that time. Is really quite unique. And I think that is why you see such a proliferation of art from this period of kind of early 16th century to the 17th century, because there was a market, there were members, they could have stalls in marketplaces. They had art dealers, and also a whole range of other artisans as well, glassmakers, engravers. So several of these also worked in other mediums like tapestry, painting doors, and that kind of thing. So I can really imagine, if you went to Delft, or to Leiden, or to Amsterdam in the 1700s, that you would be kind of, it would be not difficult to get your hands on a original work. Um, okay, so let's take a look at some art. I'm very sorry that, because of limitations of our digital medium, that we can't see this work in person. I can send you links, and the websites. Most of these are on the Royal Greenwich Museum or British Museum or various Dutch museums, and you can really like take a really close look. So yes, this painting is called Ships Trading in the East, and it's really, I selected it for a couple of reasons. So he's credited with being the first Dutch marine artist, and he began as a painter of ceramics, of Delftware, and so he traveled extensively. And I feel like you can really see that in this work, right? That attention to detail, painting on porcelain. There's a kind of quaintness or a kind of picturesqueness to the figures. It's heavily stylized, as in to me, it's not quite natural in terms of the movements of the ships or the movement of the sails. And he also was commissioned to design a series of tapestries as well that commemorated the English Lord Admiral, at that time, Lord Howard of Effingham, who later became Earl of Nottingham, for his victory over the Spanish Armada. And so that kind of shows his background in different kinds of mediums, and also that there was interest globally or across Europe for works by Dutch artists, and was seen like a status symbol for the nobility. So you can really see the attention and detail here to the rigging. And so he really was seen as a pioneer of this new style of painting naval scenes and battles. So I find this painting very tidy, very orderly, almost kind of whimsical. There's, appears to be some pretty brisk wind, but they're not overpowered. Most of them seem to be going downwind or on a reach. It's a very idealized landscape. Critics have said that this has been perhaps to depict the East Indies, as you can see on the wharf there, various people from various nations trading with each other. And it's quite an unusual painting. And why I chose it was because it shows ships from many different nations. So the art historians have identified that the ship on the left is flying both the Dutch tricolor, the red, white, and blue, as well as the flag of the province of Zealand. The center ship is flying, perhaps most of you recognize the St. George's Cross, as well as the Royal Standard, which actually confused me a bit because I thought the Royal Standard was usually only flown if the, royalty was actually on board, but, who knows? Who knows? And then the ship to the right of that is a Spanish vessel. It looks like they're preparing to fire a salute. And then to the very far right is another Dutch ship that's flying the Admiralty of Amsterdam and Dutch pennant. So you really, I guess, as a viewer, had to recognize these flags at that time. Maybe the general public did know these flags, especially if you were from a port city, right? And so what this is really symbolic of is a peaceful scene showing Dutch and Spanish and English ships trading. And so critics have suggested that this might be an allegory for the benefits of peace after so many naval wars. And it was painted in 1614, which is sort of right in the period during the 12 years truce, right? And then there's another possibility that this painting was commissioned by the Archduke and Archduchess, Albert and Isabella, who were the Spanish governors of Brussels at that time. But there's not a lot of evidence for this, but it would still be kind of an interesting kind of fact that, again, showing that there was a European market for Vroom's work. And so I find it interesting that yeah, I just find it interesting he received like commissions from I don't know how they would get word to him, but that he would have received these commissions. And also that art was kind of traded, like like the commodities that were possibly on these ships. Um, and another fact as well is that Dutch economics at that time really highly valued and prospered from free trade, and they considered these to be international waters. So it's really almost literally depicting kind of these calm waters, right? Possibly to symbolize that smoothness of trade between the nations and maybe kind of hopeful. So I found these really colorful scenes, kind of reminded me of the work of Pieter Bruegel the Elder from a previous generation, who was a Flemish painter known for his like peasant scenes and kind of tiny figures, which as a modern day viewer I find pretty funny, but I don't think they were meant to be funny. Um, and just to give you a bit more familiarity, like I wasn't familiar with these, who is like 17th century maritime flags are pretty specialized knowledge. So I had to go look. There's a wonderful website if you're interested called navalaction.ca or .com, I think, and it just has organized by country various like historical maritime flags, which really helps to identify them. So on the top row, we have the Dutch tricolor. And sometimes that red is a little bit more of an orange color. So it was really quite funny. I sail with a skipper currently, Roel van der Waal, who was like from the Netherlands, and he flew his blooper recently. He took a photo, and at first I thought it was a little strange. I'm like, Roel, why are you flying the French flag? And then when I was doing research, was talking like, oh, actually, Roel, you're flying the Dutch tricolor, and so he was really impressed that I knew I knew that. And so Zealand flag with the red Dutch line is shown in the middle. It was a little bit tricky to find the other one, the Amsterdam Admiralty flag. So that revealed to me that some of these provinces had their own admiralty, they had their own fleets, and so to recognize each other needed their own flags. And then we have some of the British flags on the bottom row, the St. George Cross that was at that time flown by the English Tudor Navy. And as well, the Navy was divided into three squadrons, the red, white, and blue squadrons. So they would fly this version from 1625, which was kind of the time this painting was done, would have been shown like this. But later on, they updated it. I think in maybe I don't quite remember. I think in the next 100 years they updated their red ensign so it had the Union Jack in the corner. And then there's also this royal standard from the House of Stuart, which I believe was only flown when, a member of the royal family was actually on board. But it's so I'm not quite sure why that ship would have had a member of maybe it's more of an idealized image. So hopefully that will help you as well, because we'll see these flags reoccur in a lot of the paintings. And just a bit of a close up, I can see these two ships from the painting, the British ship and I believe the Spanish ship kind of in proximity to each other. The figures are a bit indistinct, but they both seem to have carrying pretty full crew, busy crew, as crew always are. And so it is a kind of a romantic image of peace between these nations, a very, very rare moment of peace, right? So it just kind of shows how Rome was using these ships as kind of like symbolic. And then here's a bit of a close-up of, or a bit of a detail of various traders. You can see on the very far left a wealthy patron, and his servants are carrying an umbrella, and they're going to negotiating the sales of what looks like possibly coffee beans. And so it's a busy scene of people from various nations, very multicultural, yeah. Okay, so I don't know if how familiar some of you are with looking at art, but what I like to do is break it down. And this is also the way that we introduce this to first years in at OCAD University to talk about to do what's known as a visual analysis. So you look at components individually, so things like line. So you're just looking at a paint, just looking at its line, and then the use of color and then shape, the different shapes, geometric circles and squares and whatnot. Forms, different forms can be sort of figures. It could be larger forms, could be forms like trees or ships themselves. Value, which really has to do with the kind of the light and dark, so the contrast. Space, which might include white space, and also how negative space, so wherever the figures are not, and also how your eye travels and moves through space. And then the texture is particularly if it's a work of sculpture. So not all paintings include all of these elements or have really notable elements. What I tend to focus a lot on, for me is what I notice versus space, value, and color. I really take a note of how my eye travels throughout the scene and how the work draws me in. And then I look a lot at things like composition and the balance of the work. So that might help if you want to create notes of your own. So what we do is to observe each of the formal elements and just know your observations in terms of like what you notice with a line. For example, is the line very sharp and defined? Is the line quite blurred? Is the line dotted? Are the lines even visible, right? And then color, is the color, what are the main colors being used? What is the color palette? Is there a lot of color that is contrasting or jarring, or so each of the painters have a different color palette. And so once you have your observations of each of these elements, then you can start to think about how they relate to each other, because they're not really quite separate from each other. For example, value and color, even if a painter is only using the color blue, like Picasso, he might be using different values of that to create shadows and light or dimension. And so usually we ask the students, once they've done that, is to consider the function of that. So what would be the function of having a more muted color palette would be to perhaps give a sense of calmness. Or the previous work by Vroom is really, really colorful. To me, the function of that is that it really gives a sense of a lot of activity and a lot of busyness. The more colors you have, the more of a sense of like busyness I get from the painting. And so from considering those functions, I then develop a sort of interpretation to what is the meaning and the vision of the work, which can really differ from viewer to viewer. So my reading of that work as a sort of idealized romantic image of peace in peace in Europe at the time might be differ from someone else's reading. And so that's when you kind of formulate a claim about the work, which is supported by the observation of formal elements. And so this is when a student is asked to do visual analysis, they have to really just write an essay that has a thesis about what the artist's vision is and support it with the analysis of the visual elements. Yeah, so I hope that is like helpful as we look at some of the works going forward. And also you can kind of take this to a gallery, when you visit a gallery, And also it's really great to go to a gallery with someone. Like I always enjoyed going to the gallery with my sister and my parents because they all saw something different in the work and they all noted something different and just really added to our enjoyment of the work. Okay, so next we have room student for Chalice. This is called Ships on a Turbulent Sea. It's approximately, could have been done any period after 1612. We're not sure. He was born in Ghent around 1584 and actually kind of died before Vroom. He had a kind of a shorter life. I only think he lives into his 50s. Um, he was Flemish by birth, but spent most of his career in Holland. And his parents were among those Protestants who fled Ghent when it was captured by the Spanish Catholics. And he's considered to be the greatest maritime painter of his generation. And his works were even collected by painters such as Rembrandt and Rubens. So it's really appreciated by other painters. And one of those reasons is that he's kind of called this, someone called him the Raphael of marine painting. Um, and he was commissioned as well to produce a work for the Hampton Royal Court, Rome's Palazzo Venezia, also the collection of some of his works in the collection of the German Emperor. So even during this time again that Dutch art was really valued and traded. And the reason it's really difficult to identify the date of when he painted some of his books is because he sold them on the open market and a lot of them were unsigned. So we can only identify about 20 of his paintings. So his style, you can really see, even within one generation, that evolution from those really busy, bright, kind of, colorful seascapes that borrow a lot from the Baroque tradition to a more monochromatic painting. And this painting really emphasizes the sky, almost like two-thirds of the painting is just clouds and grays as well as the sea, and it's really trying to create an atmosphere, right? So this is a more simplistic style, more simple composition, and it really influenced future generations of maritime art, as well as still lifes by painters such as Van Gogh. And so this shows a period of transition between the realism of the Baroque period to a more tonal phase. And his style is really recognized for his use of light hues, light effects, as well as grays on grays, so painted. And it was really admired and kind of appreciated at the time for a more kind of slightly more naturalistic style. He also loved the theme of having fishing boats and choppy waters near the shore. His settings are often a little bit ambiguous of where they are, kind of more symbolic. And so he really focuses on weather rather than a naval battle. And so you can see in his work the beginning of a very long-standing theme of the ship as symbolic of the human spirit or the human soul struggling against the forces of nature. Um, and I see it as also very symbolic of Dutch individualism. So this idea of the solitary Protestant believer kind of struggling alone to understand their connection to faith. So there are other ships nearby, but they're not really able to help if they're sort of struggling spiritually. So I don't know if this painting has a moralistic message, but you can kind of read into it or just kind of see it as a a scene full of movement and take comfort in the fact that we're nice and warm and dry at home. Yeah. What else about this painting? Yeah, so I think with this painting, people see it as a reminder of just human fragility against the forces of nature and the power of the divine here. And that's just something that will occur again and again in many other paintings. Okay. How am I doing for time? Okay. Good. Okay, so one generation after, we have Simon de Vigler. This painting is called Shipping Off the English Coast, and I chose this painting for its similarity in composition, and also in color palette to Portalis's work. So de Vigler was born in 1601, so one generation after Portalis, and he lived in both Delft and was a resident of Amsterdam. And this move to Amsterdam might have been possible because he was commissioned to do some designs for the arrival of the French Queen Maria de' Medici. And he also received some pretty lucrative commissions for things like tapestry designs, painting some organ church doors, and stained glass windows. So very much in demand. His sister, I can't quite pronounce her name, Niels de Vigler, also was a painter of still life. So it kind of shows how, these painting could really become a very family business. And they both adopted de Vigler as like a pen name, which means the flyer in Dutch. So he was considered a very important and influential of his artist of his generation, and he's kind of an early proponent of this Dutch realist tradition. Um, he's described really by critics and historians as the link between that second and third generations, and that and then one of his students also we will see a lot of similar elements in terms of this kind of tranquility but brightness. So early in his career, his work was seen to be a lot more dramatic and stormy, but then later on kind of shifted into these kind of calmer coastline scenes. And then yet once again, like his teacher, lots of emphasis on the atmosphere, on the sea, on the sky, and these poor ships look just, like they're just battling the elements and trying to make their way across the shore. So what we see on the left is a small fort in the style of Henry VIII that's flying the flag of Saint George again, and that this might be the Fort Paul in the Humber estuary, which is on the northeastern coast of England, and that river kind of leads into the city of Hull. This period was about the beginning of another civil war. Oh yes, this was the beginning of the civil war between the royalists, British royalists, and the parliamentarians. And the parliamentarians had control of the ports at that time. And so you can see the fort is occupied by soldiers. There's also a little bit indistinct, but there's also soldiers on the rocks below. And so in the center of the painting is the Dutch ship, sort of on a port broadside view. Um, and we critics believe that this painting may have been a Dutch commission because the Dutch ship is seen kind of almost at the center of the painting with the light coming right down on it. Whereas the English fort as well as the English ship off the side are sort of in shadow and in darkness. There's also a small yacht with some passengers in the foreground as well. Um, and so there's one reading of this painting which sees it as a Civil War painting because Charles I was actually barred from the city, where there was also, and the slave hull also had a colony of Dutch artists. I don't know, I couldn't quite understand that reading. It seemed a little convoluted to me. I think it's a little bit more simple in terms of the narrative, in that it appears to me as though the Dutch trading ship is outrunning the English ship as well as the English fort, and that perhaps the English were attempting to capture this boat, but that, to no avail, that this Dutch ship is sort of like outrunning the chase. So that's kind of my reading of it. It would certainly align with Vigler's, nationality and Dutch nationalist pride as well. And I feel too that the painting is structured or composed in such a way that it really draws the eye inward, and it kind of, I call it kind of a tunneling effect where you kind of start at the other edges and you notice the fork, but then your eye circles in almost like a spiraling to the center of the painting. Yeah, so you can even see in this painting that the symbolism and allegory are very subtle. I don't think if you were if you're just looking at the ship, I think when you look at it more and more closely and you look at the flags and you look at the shore and the ships ahead, and you can read into what's going on in the scene. I'd love to hear other people's interpretations as well, I think when we wrap up. So what also is notable for me is that this artist, he doesn't shy away from complex compositions. Like he set himself up with a lot of challenging elements, like the seashore, the ships, the water, and having them all balanced in such a way that made for a very like engaging painting is really not easy to do, and he makes it look simple. Um, so I think it's a work of really great contrast between light and dark, as well as attention to detail with a lot of narrative to it. And I couldn't resist this other painting by Bigler as well. Again, I think I like this one even more for its sense of movement. Like it was just so striking to have a painting that really was just dominated by by the thunderstorm, by this kind of gold highlights, which really reminded me of much later Impressionist work that used a similar effect for highlights. But then you have this diagonal movement, the diagonal movement of the lightning and the light coming through the clouds is mimicked by the diagonal tacking of the ships as they try to beat upwind in this like stormy weather, as well as the diagonal of the spar or the boom, I think at that point, and the diagonal as well of the shape of the sail. So it's all kind of working in really quite like amazing harmony for me. Yeah, so I just wanted to to show you this work around the same time. I get a real sense of panic from these poor souls on board. And this is also a great demonstration of what some critics have called his silvery, kind of the silvery tone or silvery tonality. And there's a really beautiful palette too of kind of pink highlights and yellows in order to convey the sky. Um, yeah, I think this painting would, just it looks so modern to me. I can't believe it was done almost four centuries ago. Okay. Next, I'll talk about the Van de Velde. This is an engraving of the elder Father Willem van de Velde, and on the left. And actually, this was a portrait of the time he was a ship's draftsman to King Charles II, so he had already moved to England at that time. And then to the right is one of the examples. So this father and son duo, they are viewed even today as the most influential maritime artists of the 17th century because of their relocation to London. And he was born around, the elder was born around 1610. He had quite a long life, lived until 1693. Again, he was the son of a Flemish skipper and barge master, and so he joined his father at sea at a really young age. And he's really a self-taught artist. Um, by the 1640s, so in his early 30s, he was established as the official artist of the Dutch fleet. And so the title at that time was a draftsman. I think of it as kind of like an illustrator, and he would go out on a really small boat called a galeot and record and sketch battles as they're ongoing around him. So I can imagine what that must be like. And he would transform those sketches in his studio to kind of these detailed ship's portraits and also like panoramic style paintings. He's really famous for his pen paintings, what are called pen paintings, where these really detailed monochromatic pictures using graphic and ink. So He and his son moved to England in 1672, which was nicknamed the disaster year of the Dutch Republic, because that very year, Charles II had just been restored to the throne, and he was very he and of course I think the rest of the English nobility and trading economy were, they just could not compete with the Dutch in terms of their naval power and their free trade and their prices. So they tried for a long, there were several kind of skirmishes and wars and embargoes and whatnot before that time. And so when he was restored to the throne, he launched a attack. He, I think, formed a coalition with France as well as Munster to have these embargoes on the Dutch trading ships, and then attempted to attack the Dutch ports in that year, 1672. And this is what I find so fascinating, kind of the reason I wanted to give this talk. At the very same time that he launched his attack on Dutch merchant and Dutch Navy ships, he also was a huge admirer of Dutch still life and art and artisans. And so he imported, a huge number of Dutch art and artisans, So I'm just like trying to reconcile that in my mind. Like here you are on one hand, launching a ship on people, but then you have appreciation for their art and culture enough so that you import a father and son duo and pay them 100 quid a year to live in the Queen's house and to make work. And I was reading about this on the subway, and not only did Charles II do this, but he also commissioned quite a few portraits of himself in naval battles from Dutch artists. So he would have Dutch artists living in England depicting battles and scenes of the Dutch Anglo Wars. And it's just sort of like this is so, I don't know if this is wonderful or ridiculous or a bit of both. So I don't know what you make of that. Very contradictory. So he really admired not only Dutch artists, but also the entire kind of skilled trades, the guilds, and he really wanted to grow British industries, which at that time were sort of after, so much turmoil of the English Civil War, was sort of like, in a lot of chaos. So yes, the father and son were from what I can tell, very entrepreneurial, very pragmatic, and they saw, perhaps at the time, there was just so much chaos and invasion during that periods that they made the decision to move and to become Dutch expats. And at that time, they were housed at the Queen's House in Greenwich, and I have a photo. I have a view of that. This is what Queen's House would have looked like in the 1680s. Um, one more fact too. The reason I chose this particular engraving was that when Turner, the British painter Turner, saw this engraving, he cites this as the reason that he became a painter. And Turner was an avid collector of Van de Velde's engravings and drawings, as well as many, many other generations of British artists as well. Um, so. And Vanderbilt was really more of his son was more of the artist. He was really more of I think the elder is seen as a lesser artist, but the one because of his background, really known for the accuracy and detail of ship's rigging and construction. It's like incredibly accurate. So that's what he's really remembered for. So yes, father and son come to England and they, happily live and saw themselves in the Queen's house. At that time, um, it was no longer used as a palace. I believe not even Greenwich Palace had been used for quite a few decades. And this house still is standing in outside London. And you can see I think that's the Royal Observatory to the left. And so for a different project, some of my poetry project actually was really fascinated by Flamsteed and how they found a way to keep time at sea. And so I went to visit the Royal Observatory and wrote like a long poem about it, not knowing that like 10 years later I'd be just as interested in this site because of all the artwork at the Queen's House. So the Queen's House at that time housed all kinds of scientists and artists, intellectuals. It was sort of like a bit of a studio space, bit of a artistic meeting ground. So whoever the king, the royal family found wanted to invite to stay to work, were housed there. And oh yes, this was a really important site, a really significant for the Vanderbilt father and son to work at because of its proximity to the Royal Dockyards, which gave them access to the Royal Navy and all their exercises, and so they could make these really detailed ship's portraits, which they later incorporated into their paintings. The Queen's House is also seen as really state-of-the-art architecture at the time. It's a very geometric building in the classical style. And so they lived in the Queen's Palace for about 10 years. I think James II was deposed in 1688, so they were no longer enjoying the royal patronage, and so they moved to Westminster. And so during that time, they had already sort of really taken advantage of the demand for their sketches and drawings in the London art market, which were really prized and collected by following generous artists. So I think what was happening was that these drawings that they were doing were so accurate that British artists used them to even trace or to use them as reference materials for their own paintings. Um, so his son, oh yeah, there's present day Queen's House in Greenwich, London. So it's a wonderful, wonderful place to visit. Um, and yes, so here is a work by the son. So we can really see his artistry here. This is called A Rising Gale, done in 1672. So his brother, he was born in Leiden in 1733, so he would have been doing this, I guess he would have been about late 30s or 40s. And he was trained by his father, but his father really wanted him to have more formal painting with a real professional artist. So that's when he went to train with Simon de Vigler. So unlike his father, his oil paintings of life at sea are really creative in terms of their approach. And they often really worked very closely together. And he used his father's drawing as a guide to create his own works. And so after moving to England, he really concentrated on painting royal yachts, man of warships, storm scenes. He painted sea battles for Charles II, as well as Charles II's brother, who was Lord High Admiral at that time. And so his choice of subject matter, I think, is very pragmatic because he's kind of painting what will sell or what his patrons are interested in. But I think, and that he might not have been necessarily eyewitness to some of these events as well. But he was made an official marine painting after the death of his father, so he had to be a bit more present at like battles and other significant, I guess, naval fleet reviews and things like that. And so in this painting, I really love the sense of realism here with this work. It really shows his very first-hand knowledge of ship's rigging, of tr sail trim, of what the crew are doing. And he combines that amazing sense of artistry with this sense of drama as well. So it is similar to De Vigo's work, again, in that the Dutch ship is shown very much under the light kind of featured. I think there's a variation of the Dutch tricolor that's flown on the mast, and then sort of the other ships are shown, kind of in shadow. There's a Dutch light fishing vessel sailing pretty close hauled as well. Um, yeah, so again, some of a really to me a really stunning work. Again, terms of the composition, quite similar to the Vigler work in that it has more than two-thirds of the work kind of covered by sky. But in terms of the technical brushstrokes, I find this to be really more advanced, just the control of light and shadow. It looks, so photographic in terms of its detail. Um, and so the reason I chose this was that 100 years later, Turner, Joseph Mallory Turner, a British artist, would be commissioned to paint a companion piece of that painting. So the the work by Van der Velde had fallen to the hands of uh, the Duke of Bridgewater, third Duke of Bridgewater, owned that painting in 1801. And so this painting is also sometimes referred to as their Bridgewater Sea Piece. And so Turner was commissioned to do this painting in 1801 as a companion piece. So companion pieces were supposed to be, similar in size. Um, and Turner found this commission to be kind of a challenge. Artistic saw this as an artistic challenge, so he created a much larger work, and also rearranged some of these elements. But a bit of background on Turner, who's born in 1778. He's the son of a barber. There's a wonderful documentary about him. He's considered, I think, rightly so, to be the greatest English landscape painter. He has, and you really feel it in his work, this huge love of nature. He really also imbues his work with a lot of significance, a lot of meanings. He had a very early talent. He enrolled in the Royal Academy at the age of 14 and spent many years traveling throughout England to paint and to sketch. He did a lot of farming scenes and landscapes and also studied abroad. So when he painted this commission, there's some very significant but subtle and fascinating differences. He really made this scene even more dramatic. The sky, like Van der Velde's paintings, really divided between the storm and the light. Um, I really feel the sense of movement in this painting, of just like any moment this boat could capsize, and that I get a much stronger feeling of the crew struggling in this version over, to me, the Vanderbilt work, the crew look like they're in control. They look calm. They look like they're not being overpowered. Whereas if you look closely at the figures in Turner's painting, there's a lot more of a feeling of scrambling activity, of just kind of barely being able, particularly the small fishing boat. The skipper is just like, barely able to maintain control of his rudder. Um, and I think that's mostly, the flags are quite faint here. Yes, this is like a Dutch, it is meant to be a Dutch boat. When you can zoom in on it, you can see the colors of it. But I think the difference is that for Turner, he is not a Dutch nationalist. He has no vested interest in depicting the Dutch mariners or sailors or fishermen as heroic. Um, he is just interested in human struggle. And I think this represents for me a sort of a turn, a historical turn, where you see the shift from maritime art being sort of performative and nationalistic and patriotic towards being a bit more about the human struggle, so that allegory isn't quite so heavy-handed anymore. And so I think John Ruskin calls Turner the founder of modern art, and I think that is really why, to me, what makes a work modern is that it focuses not so much on like really obvious allegory or symbolism, but kind of leaves it up a little bit more to an interpretation, and it's a little bit more about the human spirit or struggle. Um, yeah, so it's great. I would like we could do this in person. We could put the two paintings side by side and really look at the differences in terms of one of them being even things like in terms of sailing, like being on the port tack versus like of a starboard tack versus on a port tack. Like I think it's so much harder to control boat. And there's another small boat. It's hard to see in distance. Also look like a rowboat of some kind. And I couldn't quite tell if this was four boats kind of all about to collide with each other or two or three, because it could be another boat. I see another mast with a flag behind them. Yeah, the sense of imminent collision, quite differs quite a lot from in subtle ways that might not be obvious for us from Van der Vels, in which the boats look like they're properly trimmed and not being too overpowered. And then this was a painting that I really focused an essay in my book about that I was really drawn to called Turner's A Slave Ship. So also with Turner, you start to see these works that are really critical of the government of the transatlantic slave trade. And so here you kind of start to see work that is the allegory is more difficult, complex. And so there's a lot of, this is done 40 years later. And so when I looked at this work, it also seemed to have a lot of impressionistic elements to it as well in terms of brushstrokes. And it's such a leap, right? From the work he was doing when he was younger. So there's this ship was really called, also previously called The Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying. So he was inspired by Thomas Clarkson's book on the history of abolition of slave trade, which also talked about the events of Zong, which was a slave ship that I think would either be calmed or beset by storms or both, and had to they treated the African peoples as cargo, and they threw them overboard because they could claim insurance on them. And so this became a famous court case. And Zong is also the title, if you're interested in this kind of really dark period of their history, was that's all the title of a long poem by the Canadian Caribbean poet Amnar Boosie Phillips that uses a lot of excerpts from that. So I think that this was the only painting I could find that depicted the transatlantic slave trade, even through centuries of maritime art. Like none, I found it really notable that most of the Dutch maritime painters painted ships quite close to shore, rather than ships that were kind of at sea or becalmed or beset by storms. They were always presenting the ships in a really magnificent light, or a very kind of a noble kind of quality to them. So with Turner's work, you see really the ship being completely battered. You see shapes of humans in water. It's to me a very disturbing painting. But again, the light is so magnificent here as well. There's not really a sense of a foreground or background. It's barely kind of contained. It's only the ship that gives it a bit of perspective. It could be a foggy day. It could be a storm that's been breaking. But to me also that this really represents quite that a sense of the light might represent kind of maybe a little bit of hope in a scene that is a really kind of chaotic, turbulent, dramatic, but also really disturbing as well. And I think he balances out, or he kind of maybe even goes more towards a side of tumultuousness and intensity, just to see almost how much we could take, right, from a painting, like how much can he disturb us. So this painting evokes a lot of mixed reactions during his time from his contemporaries for the abstraction and for the subject matter. And even today, it's a really debated painting that some really see it as evidence of Turner's distaste for the Industrial Revolution and the valuing of like human lives for the sake of like economics, while others, particularly David Daberdeen, finds his work very voyeuristic, and it really takes away agency from the enslaved subjects. Um, and so, Turner was a big admirer of Dutch painters in his work. really also can see, even though his technique is so different, that he is still using his ship as a allegory for the human spirit and the ability of nature to just, and and the sublime to just wipe us all off the map. And so what I find also remarkable about Turner's work is that it's really not possible to feel neutral about his images. And I really invite you to have your own relationship with his work. I think of him as both being very forward thinking, in his approach, very ahead of his times, but at the same time, he's also part of his time. So he can, I think, do both. He can critique the slave trade in his work, but also render, the horror of these drowning people in a way that kind of makes it into a bit of a spectacle. But yes, it's just my own personal reading of his work, that I think is still kind of ongoing. Okay, how are we doing for time? I think, yeah, I'm way over time. So I'm supposed to wrap up, I think, at 12:30, right? So the other works I wanted to show, if you want to take a look at for your own interest, Winslow Homer and a lot of the American maritime art, it really centers that human subject. Here is a man kind of on a boat that has a broken mast surrounded by sharks, and he's just got some sugar cane there, which is also symbolic. This is done in 1899, at the time where race relations in the US were also very fraught, very tense, with things like lynchings and Ku Klux Klan. But this man, to me, his expression is very determined. He doesn't look hopeless at all, and he's not even looking at the sharks. He's looking, off to the distance. And here's a real difference in terms of color palette. A lot more of these bright jewel tones, possibly because of the turquoise waters of the Caribbean or the southern United States as well. But again, we see the ship or the boat as an allegory for that human spirit. And now what has shifted is that human subject has now become someone that would not have been represented back in the Dutch Golden Age. And then a contemporary work by Kahindi Wiley, who's an LA-based artist, called The Ship of Fools, was also on display in the Queen's House as part of the Royal Greenwich Museum, and as a way to add some contrast and to take us full circle. So this is a painting of about migrant workers, right? With each of the migrants having very, very different expressions, and this tree of life in the middle, which may represent their hope for a new life. And the only way they have to steer is with a paddle again. And again, allegory and symbolism really kind of evoke back to those earlier paintings of the Dutch maritime period, where the subjects may change, allegory might be different, but the ship is still kind of symbolic of something. And she also evokes a lot of maritime brushstroke, kind of technical brushstroke in terms of the sea and the sky as well. It's quite heavily stylized. And there is way in the background, which people have noted, a 17th century ship that people say could be a merchant ship, could be a trading ship, could be a slave ship that's kind of in their past. And the title of this painting evokes Hieronymus Bosch's painting Ship of Fools as well. So we sort of come full circle back to Baroque art, with even a contemporary painter harkening back to and responding to maritime tradition, reimagining it, reinventing it. It's not attempting to be a painting in the maritime tradition, but it's definitely acknowledging the tropes and the motifs we've seen. Yeah, so that just about wraps up. If you want to find my book, this is the title. I hope you enjoyed some of the, tidbits and facts that I learned while doing my research. Um, yeah, I'm sorry for going over time, but I maybe have time for a couple of questions if or reactions even.
I would just ask people if they want to comment to raise their hand and I can unmute you. I'll start by saying that was fascinating and very interesting to see the progression from the very early things to the present, and how they look back and forward at the same time. The the Dutch
Absolutely.
the Dutch East India Company records are very little explored to this point. There are millions of pages of records as well,
Mhm.
stored all around the world. When I was in Japan, there was I was at a Japanese university, and in the library there was a handwritten dictionary, um, that had been written by somebody working for the Dutch East India Company in Jakarta, and they had compiled a Dutch um, Japanese dictionary
Oh, wow.
based on conversations with Dutch traders who were coming through Jakarta. So this person had never been to Japan, or spoken to any Japanese people whatsoever, but they were making a dictionary nevertheless. Um, kind of like creating a dictionary, Martian English dictionary based on conversations with astronauts or something. Um, but to see these pieces of art, it's interesting how they all treat the water in kind of similar ways too, with very rough water in almost all cases. And I noticed also that a lot of them situate a boat in the background in the distance.
Hmm.
Um, Usually it looks like maybe at anchor with no sails up.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they did often do sometimes what were known as ship's portraits, which only focus on one ship at a time, which might have been commissioned maybe by the admiral or captain. But I like the ones where there's lots of going on in terms of the background, and I think the choppy waters themselves might be because of the North Sea, and the channel, but also choppy waters also very symbolic of the ongoing naval wars. It was just rife with they were constantly at war with each other and trying to gain control of ports and seaways. So maybe that's one of the reasons why. And also makes for a more dramatic painting,
Yeah.
right? You
Yeah.
know, if you see like a ship struggling in these waters, it seems to be very much symbolic of what their national identity was going through.
You can see emotion increasing in the art too,
Absolutely, yeah, yeah,
right up to Turner, where, even within Turner, between his view of the gale and then the slave ship,
yep,
that was what just painted 7 years after Britain had abolished slavery.
yes, yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, they really like their drama because they're not getting it from anywhere else. They don't have TV, they don't have Netflix, they don't have film, right? So all they are getting sense of drama is music, and arts and painting, so and literature. So I think that's one of the few places they had to express those emotions. Yeah, yeah,
yeah. We don't have. I mean, we have so many technologies of reproduction now, where we
absolutely.
can record sound and video and play it back.
Yeah,
you know, Even using our phones. And at the time, if you wanted a picture, you had to paint it. If you wanted to hear music, you had to go to find a performance or
yeah,
do it yourself.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Seamus, you had a question? Oh, you're muted. Maybe I can un
First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Um, uh, Approximately 50 years ago, I did study the Dutch Republic. I still have one or two of the books. I've forgotten most of it. But what I found so interesting was about the constant naval wars
Yeah.
and struggles for power. And I know this might irk some of my fellow viewers, but William of Orange, who was brought to Ireland, which was then in the British Empire, to establish control of Protestantism in terms of the monarchy in England. I understand it all, but these historical struggles still have issues in the world today,
Absolutely.
particularly not just in Ireland, but in many other places as well, including the Middle East and so forth. And what you portray so very interesting is the trading scenes, and trade was so important, and the quest for power. And I'm sorry to say that, for instance, I lived in Ireland and England, but a lot of people didn't understand the William of Orange and so forth. It was all related to not just religion, but power and so forth and so forth. And I do understand how the Calvinists felt in Holland. Part of my background on my father's side is of a very strict Protestant Christian principles. And yes, in their gospel halls, they had no paintings or anything. And then you bring it all into art. And a very interesting point came up, and in relation to what Graham was saying and you were saying, that the majority of the people didn't know what was going on. And uh, I didn't I didn't have the time to stay on in university because I did fine arts as well to sort of the connection. I don't have a royal budget behind me, but you brought up stuff that was so interesting that I regret not having pursued it further. And my compliments to that you can actually bring your family to an art gallery and they can compare it with you. I wish I had a family like that. And thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I know I got very lucky. Like, we were not a wealthy family, but my parents just love art and they love beauty. And so by the time we were 10 or 11, my sister could tell the difference between a Degas and a Monet. It was quite fascinating. People would stop and just be in awe of us because we could but yeah, it definitely was also a bit of a bit learning curve for me. Baroque and this period of art was not like I love Vermeer. So I know I could talk a lot about Vermeer and Rembrandt as well. But this was, these were all new artists for me. But I have a degree in English literature, so we learn a lot of research techniques and summary paraphrase techniques, which I found really, really useful. And then what really matter, I mean, there's so many great academic textbooks, there's so many great courses on the topic, but I think what really matters is you create your own connections to being art, and spending time looking at the works over a long period of time. I always see something different, and then I think a lot about what it must have been to be alive at that time. And all that requires, you don't require university education for that. It just requires an imagination to really picture what they must be like. I can just really feel that they really had to produce these artists. That's what I'm getting a sense of, that just they had to keep producing because their work at the same time was a object of trade, even as they are depicting the Dutch trade, So it's quite circular that way.
Thank you.
Bill McNaughton. I was a little late joining, so I might have missed a mention, but today is the 220th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. So we can all raise a glass after the show to the immortal memory.
Thank you, Bill. That's a lovely little tidbit of information there of history. And Seamus, it's never too late to take a course. Go ahead and do it, if you will.
I'm using my imagination.
Yeah, we should all go as a group together to.
That would be fun.
Yeah, I know to go to I would love to go in person.
I'd like to thank you, Phoebe, and I was fascinated by the artists who were trying to promote peace, looking at the trade situation, and looking overall how the world hasn't really changed very much.
Yeah.
We're constantly at war. We're constantly trying to have more power, and money is a big issue.
Yeah.
But I did want to share with you, my late husband was a a student at Cambridge in England, and he purchased this print at a sidewalk stall, and this is a Turner.
Oh boy.
I don't know how well you can see it because it may be you may have a reflection.
Yeah.
But it's one of the more traditional Turners that I was familiar with. I was not familiar with the ones that you showed us, but this one is Venice. The real like the canals in Venice. And I have had this hanging in my office ever since I was married to my first husband. And so my family has dibs on who's going to get this print after I'm gone.
Yeah, I think even now we should be supporting younger artists, who are depicting, like, like the last artist or show Wiley, if we can find, I'm lucky I look at OCAD, so I always try to buy something from the students or something that, to add to the kind of collection because like we need artists to reflect on our times. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm with you 100%.
Yeah.
Okay, Patrick, you're on. Unmute yourself.
Oh. Hi, Phoebe. That was a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. An enormous amount of research gone into that. I just wanted to comment on one thing. You showed a picture by Valden. Valden, was it?
Yeah, Van de Velde, the younger or the elder?
I think. The second, the younger one.
Yes, yeah.
No, the second one.
Yeah.
He'd be younger, wouldn't he? Older, younger or older?
Younger.
Younger. Okay. And it was like a large Dutch barge. It was the middle of the picture, and it had what typically that I used to see in Europe was where I am now actually. These Dutch sailing barges with lee boards. They didn't have keels like
Oh.
our boats have. They have a lee board on each side that you can see where it swings down. And it was very, very interesting to see that picture.
Yeah, I love that one too. Van der Velde, it's just such an amazing painter, really creative in the composition that he chooses.
The,
Um,
and the light on the canvas was
it's
wonderful.
just amazing. Like it could have been painted like, last year. It's
Yeah.
just, it's stunning. I'm glad you guys all share my admiration. It was so hard to choose work. I think I spent 2 or 3 weeks just looking at work and I'm like, which one do I choose? But that one was great to choose to have the connection with Turner.
Yeah.
You did a fine job. I took a history of art course before I went to Europe when I was a very young woman, so I would have some sense of what I was going to be seeing when I went to all those art galleries. And you've just piqued my interest yet again in looking at art, and the lesson you gave about the elements and principles of visual analysis was excellent. Really appreciated that.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, it's really useful. We have a really great book that we use called Line Color Form, and it has like every page describes different types of lines, different types of colors. So then if you're looking at a work like that's very, very modern, like Donald Judd, it's just like a bunch of squares on a wall, and or Gerhard Richter, which is so abstract, or then you can at least kind of break it down to something that you can have a vocabulary to talk about. Sometimes it's so hard to interpret modern work, like modern art. So that I found really helpful. Like work that is realistic, has actual elements you can recognize is a lot easier to talk. Even the Impressionists that have like Starry Night, there's so much to talk about because there's still representational elements to it. But when you get into highly intellectual modern art, that's when I find the elements are really useful.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
So I will be sending you a little token of our appreciation This is the second time you've been with us, and both times you've been brilliant in what you've been sharing.
Oh,
So
thank you.
thank you. So let's just give her a nice little Shellback round of applause there. And I hope we'll see you back sometime, you know.
Yes, some of your talks look so great.